Hi, we're here with another series of Troon Talk conversations. Our guest today is Jason Cole, viticulturist. Welcome, Jason.
Hi.
So, you were born in Hawaii, which I don't really associate with grapes that often. How does one go from Hawaii to becoming a viticulturist?
Yeah, good question. I think kind of just dumb luck. I was going to UC Davis, trying to decide what I was going to major in. They have a specialty program, as many of you know, in viticulture and enology. And, I didn't know that much about what I wanted to do, but I knew it would be plant and agriculture associated and, something specialized in alcohol and agriculture and plants at 18 years old sounded about right. So I tried it expecting to change majors or whatnot and stuck with it for whatever that is now, over 20 years, I think.
So what was the experience like at UC Davis? What's involved in a viticulture course at the university?
Yeah, I think maybe one of the things that really appealed to me about this, this topic in school, but also just this industry, is that it is so multidisciplinary. So, there are a lot of different tracks that you need to maintain for that degree at UC Davis, which includes food science, but it also includes sort of plant science, agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. Like I said, there was a lot of different tracks you could take. One of the things that I took that was one of my favorite classes was actually about brewing beer, but that was part of, the bigger picture of fermentation science, et cetera. Lots of in the field labs as well. But I would say one of the things about UC Davis that is, I guess, a detraction, they do a really good job at, preparing you in all of those sort of multidisciplinary topics. At the time when I was going there, they didn't have a lot of sort of practical hands-on stuff on campus. And so they really relied on you to go and do internships, et cetera. So a big part of that program in my, learning and experience has really been on the job. UC Davis did a great job at creating a foundation, but I think probably I learned as much at 4 years managing a large ranch in Napa that I did at UC Davis.
Is there much interaction between the viticulture and enology at Davis?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there is, but they certainly are, separate. For example, a lot of the viticulture-oriented professors who are in that, or faculty in that program, are actually horticulture. They're as part of the horticulture program. Whereas some of the winery engineers, although they are part of that department, might teach or be involved in some other aspects of the university. So it is interesting, again, that multidisciplinary thing. I think let's say in the new world, we are often thinking about winemaking and viticulture separately. And that really contrasts to my experience in Europe when I did a master's there, which was much more integrated. And the assumption was very much that any individual would have a very balanced, both education and work life in both realms. And so it is a new world thing to separate them like that.
Well, that's interesting because you have a more extensive academic background than a lot of people. You're running into viticulture. You have a bachelor's from UC Davis, but you also have a master's degree from your program in Europe. What was that?
Yeah, I sometimes say that I'm a little overeducated in this topic because I did do 2 programs and essentially both specializing in viticulture and enology. That was really rewarding. I'm really glad I did that. But I think the master's program maybe was, not critical to my, my understanding of how to grow grapes and make wine, but it really opened my eyes to sort of a different culture of both teaching that academically and practicing in the field. So, for me, doing that European program was very eye-opening, not necessarily in the academics, which I had, done a lot of in my bachelor's degree, but in the exposure that it gave me to different approaches, both in and out of the classroom. And that was really valuable in a lot of ways. And I got to learn from really some of the world's best in viticulture and enology in that European program because it was a consortium program, which included, I think it was 7 different universities in Europe that all kind of got together, collected sort of the best professors in this field and had intensive classes in one place in Montpellier. So that was also really rewarding. But you're right, I have an excessive amount of academic experience in viticulture and enology. Probably unnecessary, but it still gave me a lot of really eye-opening experiences between Davis, Napa, Europe, and now in Oregon. I feel really good about all those experiences.
So how would you describe the differences in the approach in the European programs as compared to the American programs?
Yeah, that's a good question. The program that I did too was even in itself maybe a little unique beyond any of those programs, because there is sort of an equivalent in Montpellier to the standard Davis program, which is in French and is a strictly French program. Whereas the program that I went to was this international program that had been fairly recently created by Alain Carbonneau, very famous viticulturist in France. And the goal of it was to get different students from all over the world to come and do this sort of intensive viticulture enology program, as opposed to, a more standard experience where maybe you have a degree and a list of classes you need to take, and you need to get through those classes to get, to the level that you might do your thesis, for example. In this case, the way that they structured it was a whole year of very intensive module programs. So we would have 3 or 4 professors from around Europe who were specialized in water stress come in and teach us a week-long class on sort of fine physiology and water stress, for example. That's all we would do for a week. And then the next week we would do something else. So that program was a little bit unique. But there's also an interesting difference globally in different countries in the way they approach higher education that I didn't really understand until I did that master's program. In the United States, in a lot of the New World, in Germany, it's very common, let's say, to do a bachelor's degree in viticulture and enology, to specialize in viticulture and enology. In most of Southern Europe, in South America, and a lot of other places, what would be normal is actually to do like an agricultural engineer degree, so a very generalized degree in your bachelor's, and then you would normally do something specialized like viticulture and enology in your master's degree. And they don't, that doesn't exist at a bachelor's level in a lot of places. So that was interesting to have people from both of those systems in a program together, you can imagine, because some people like myself were very specialized already, and some people, while they had a lot of background experience practically, might not have been academically trained in viticulture and enology before that program. So it also made it an interesting program because there was so much diversity within the students.
So then you were in the Napa Valley at Stagecoach, right? One of the most famous vineyards in Napa. What was that experience like?
That was very formative. I started there as their summer intern and eventually was, their lead viticulturist. So I really saw that operation kind of from the bottom up. That property is a little hard to describe. It's very unique. It is almost outside of Napa proper. When you get up there, it almost doesn't feel like you're in Napa anymore. You feel like you're in Mexico or something, in a totally different world, because you don't even really see the valley. But the amount of experience that it gave me in both managing lots of different varieties and rootstocks was great. But the development side, I think, was my favorite part of my time at Stagecoach, because they had just started the process of a new 100-acre development, which actually what that meant was little pieces of blocks scattered all over the ranch that added up to 100 acres. It wasn't one big 100-acre plot that we were planting. So it was a really dynamic development project. And, the thing that's most famous about that place is the rocks. So the millions of tons of rocks that have been removed from the ground to make that place possible. I don't remember what the exact number is, but Dr. Jan Krupp did, and always like to quote it to all of us, because it cost a lot of money to remove rocks out of the ground just to plant grapes. But that was really formative, and like I said, 4 years being part of that management team, which was mostly like field people and not necessarily viticulturists. It was really people who just were doing the work. I learned so much from that team, from all levels. But sort of the head vineyard manager there, Esteban, and his foreman really took me in and did a great job at trying to help me learn the real part of the job, not just the stuff that you learn in classrooms.
Well, I guess what were your biggest surprises then after coming out of an academic background into a working vineyard? What parts did the academic part help you with, and what were the surprises?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer that question because I'm not sure how much of a expectation I had already set for kind of what came next after my academic career at Davis. But not to knock the Davis program, I think it prioritizes well, actually. But I certainly started that job maybe thinking that I knew more than I did, because I knew a lot about the technicality and sort of the fundamentals of growing grapes and making wine, but that does not teach you how to actually do the job. And so I really felt like I came into it with knowing less than I thought I did, I guess, is the easiest way to say it. And, as a result, learned a lot, because it's the best way to learn something is to make mistakes. And I made plenty of them in those early days.
So it's just like the enology program.
Yeah.
So how did you come from Napa to Southern Oregon?
Yeah, that's an interesting circuitous route, because I didn't really leave Stagecoach. I wasn't specifically trying to leave Stagecoach when I left. I was actually just interested in pursuing more academic career, which was supported by my boss there, Jan. He thought that was a good thing for me. So it was a pretty smooth transition. I hired my own replacement, etc. And the program, out of several that I was interested in, I had actually considered coming to OSU for my master's instead. But in the end, that European program was, my first choice for a number of reasons, one of which they gave me a scholarship to go do it. So I kind of left Stagecoach to try to pursue an academic career, potentially coming back to Napa or even coming back to Stagecoach. That was what I kind of had in my head when I went to do that. And but where it led me, after quite a lot of international work and education, was to Oregon, because it was basically the closest thesis project that I could get to my then fiance, now wife, who was studying in Portland. And so I basically ended up with the choice of coming to Southern Oregon to do a project or going to Prosser, Washington to do a project. And I ended up here in Southern Oregon, again, not really expecting to stay here. I expected to do my project and probably move on. Funny enough, I actually got an opportunity right as I finished to go back to Stagecoach, because the person I had helped hire to replace me had just left. And in the end, I, for whatever reason, decided to stay in Oregon. And I think a lot of that was just the impression that the Applegate Valley made on me. I still have a really strong memory of the very first time I came to Southern Oregon, visited with Gabriel, who was the local extension specialist who I would be working with on this experiment. And he drove me out. Actually, I think that he actually drove me to Troon, because he had an experiment happening at Troon all those years ago. This was back in probably 2012. And just that drive from Jacksonville into Applegate, which is just very idyllic and kind of Americana, just has this really nice vibe to it. And I think that really stands out to me as like my first Southern Oregon impression. And then throughout that season, doing experiments both in Rogue Valley and Umpqua Valley, I did some things with Dick Ellis at Pebblestone, and then at Albacella with Earl Jones. Were the two locations for my experiment. So I ended up, traveling quite a bit within this area, and I just really fell in love with it. And then sort of during that time, I had been trying to buy property of my own. I had got the small inheritance that I was probably ever going to get, and deciding what to do with that, I almost invested in a property back in Hawaii, which sort of made sense to me, but found this property out in the Williams part of Applegate Valley that I really fell in love with and ended up purchasing it. And I think, that really positive impression this area gave me, combined with, now a piece of land to be tied to, really motivated me to try to figure out how to stay in Southern Oregon. And that was, very much a leap of faith. Like I said, I turned down what was probably one of the best viticulture jobs in Napa to stay here. And there was other reasons. My wife had a good reason to try to stay in Oregon, but it was definitely a leap of faith at that time, and I'm really glad that I made that choice. But at the time, I was not so certain, and I didn't even have a job here. I was doing some consulting, had met a number of people, but was just trying to figure out how to make it work after really falling in love with this place.
So let's talk about the Applegate Valley a little bit. What are the characteristics that you think define the Applegate Valley for winemaking?
Interesting. Like the rest of the Rogue Valley, it is a relatively high elevation region compared to most, at least, of Oregon in terms of wine growing. So, the result of that tends to be both kind of big diurnal changes, so very cool nights compared to the warm summers, but or the warm days rather in the summer. But it also is a dry sort of Mediterranean climate region. This is not Willamette Valley, which has rainfall through the summertime. This is Northern California comparison, I would say, in terms of what our climate looks like. And as a result, you have this kind of cooler than a lot of places in California, but still a warm growing climate. So this is Syrah country, not Pinot country. And I think that was another thing that appealed to me is it also has for the humans, it's pretty nice weather during the summer too. And that's something that everyone has always noted to me about Applegate in particular, is that it is very sunny during the wintertime when a lot of the rest of this region is covered in fog. And, that's another little unique detail about Applegate. Overall, though, I really think that it's positioned well in this cooler side of a warm climate, high elevation with these big diurnal changes. Another thing that probably characterizes this region from a growing point of view, though, is that we have a growing season that can be bordered by frost danger on both sides, and that makes it a slightly more, I don't know if extreme is the right word, but it is a challenging growing region for that region. For that reason, it's also has potential for hail some of the time. So partly because of our high elevation, we do have some added challenges, but I think it provides a lot of benefits when it comes to wine quality if we can navigate those things.
So you mentioned your first drive into the Applegate coming through Jacksonville, and I'm always impressed by there is a line there you cross from the Rogue into the Applegate where things change dramatically. So it's interesting to have an area with so many different microclimates in it.
Yeah, that's true. It's interesting. You really feel it, as you drive into Applegate, that kind of slight change of vibe. If you look at all of Rogue Valley, which I do farm, in a lot of other areas, it is, I think, one of our strengths and weaknesses as a region. And when I say that, it's just, we really can grow a lot of different varieties well here if you choose the correct site, because there is so much diversity within the sites that we experience here. I'm trying to compare it to something, but, if you spend time in Burgundy or Bordeaux, you notice that there's plenty of slight microclimates, but a lot of the focus there is on soil differences, because that's the differences they have. And here we have big soil differences, but then we also have big terrain differences and different aspect, a lot of different things that can kind of go into making a particular site terroir unique from a site that you can see, from the same property across the valley or even down the road. And that kind of keeps it interesting, I think, for someone like me who does a lot of different types of farming is, we get to grow a lot of different varieties. And even at Troon, I think we have some diversity that we're sort of learning, as we farm, and, what does best where does matter. It's not, the whole property is not the same exact terroir.
So you've been running the viticulture at Troon since 2018.
I think that's right.
And obviously a lot of changes have gone on. We'll talk about those
a
bit. But how would you place Troon within the overall climate of the Applegate Valley?
When it comes to Applegate, Troon is definitely in some of the warmer pockets of the valley. We're in this, we call it the Kubli bench, but it's, this several alluvial benches that come down off of this side of the valley that are much more open. Most of the Applegate Valley is fairly narrow. And so, in those narrow areas, there's slightly less sun exposure, but then there's also more concentration of cold air that tends to build up in the flatter, in the areas that are plantable. Whereas in this little pocket of the valley, it opens up quite a bit. And so we get to be part of this, sort of large benchland that accumulates kind of maximum sun during that day, but we're also raised up a bit off the valley floor. So we are able to escape some of the coldest areas that are down below us. Which aren't very far away. I mean, I don't know what Noble, like actual distance Noble is off the top of my head, but it's probably only, a mile maybe?
Maximum.
And it's very, very different down there in terms of how cold it gets. And so, I think that's part of the reason why, when we've chosen varieties here, we've been comfortable, kind of going a little further out in terms of having later varieties or warm loving varieties. I think we can pull that off on this site. There's a lot of things that we've planted here that I wouldn't suggest planting in a lot of other places in Applegate, because I think it's much cooler there.
So over the years you've been here, are you seeing any influence of climate change? I see it as a more erratic situation than any kind of pattern, but
it's hard to say. I mean, one thing is for sure, I think we see it in the data from the time that I've been here as a whole, more than a change over the time that I've been here. So, 2012, so what it's been about, 14 years or so that I've been in the Valley, there's certainly been a number of what I would consider, extremes that have happened. Let's say a couple of the cold events that we've had. A lot of the old timers will tell me, hey, that's, a 1 in 30 year event, 1 in 40 year event. And we've had a couple of them in the last 10 years that I've been here. Those, might not be everyone's first instinct on what climate change is going to do. But I agree with you that, what's most likely going to happen is it's going to make the extremes more extreme. And so we may have more of these cold events. But on the other side, if you look at just the basic data on, let's say, growing degree days, the last 10 years have been distinctly warmer than almost any of the decades that come before, if you look at the record. So I think we are living in a decade that is generally much warmer than it used to be. And again, I think that's mostly been a benefit to the grape growing here, because we weren't already on the hot side. We weren't already pushing the boundaries on the hot side. If anything, we were pushing the boundaries on the cooler side. So pushing us a little warmer has not been a negative by any means. But I think that's the thing that probably stands out the most in the data. But I agree. I think the extremes are probably the thing that I think about the most when I think of what the impacts of climate change are going to be, because as farmers, that's the thing that messes us up the most, is when things start to get more erratic.
So right away, when you arrived at Troon, we started to replant the entire vineyard.
Yes.
Which is obviously a major project. How do you approach replanting a vineyard? What kind of strategies do you think a grower should take into account?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, it has to depend on the situation, and that's sort of the joke. It's like you ask a farmer, what the best way to do anything is, and the same answer always applies, which is it depends, right? But I think, generally it's an opportunity to try to improve on what was there before. So just as an example, we definitely used a lot of what we knew about the old vineyard. Let's just say a given block maybe had some different soil types within it that we knew about because we had grown grapes there before. We tried to tailor the new vineyard to accommodate for that difference, and whether it be from watering differences or making block splits in different places, trying to, again, learn some lessons on what had been grown before and try to improve them. I think that's like the number one piece of advice I would give someone. But there was a lot of challenges at Troon specifically, probably more than I can go into now. But, for one thing, a lot of the vineyards that we were dealing with, the older vineyards we were dealing with, had a lot of other issues. And so it was interesting trying to navigate when trying to evaluate what I just said, which is, okay, what are the issues with this vineyard now? How can we improve upon them in the future? That doesn't necessarily apply if, the material was diseased, or if the planting was done poorly in the past, et cetera. So sort of navigating through what can we learn and what, can we just fix by not planting diseased material, just as an example, was a challenge. In our case, we also had a pretty significant challenge in that we needed to make sure that there was still a wine program that existed while we were doing the replanting, which is the part of the reason why we spread it out over a number of years. And that provided probably a bigger challenge than most of the development projects I've ever been part of. If you go back to Stagecoach, for example, that was all going into essentially virgin ground. So in that case, we'd just go do it. We didn't have to work around anything. Here, we're working around not just this is the area that was planted before and we need to replant it, but working through old infrastructure, working through drainage presence or lack thereof. In many cases, there was a lot of different factors on this project that made it much more complicated than your standard replant job.
So when you're replanting a vineyard, you're not just selecting varieties to plant. You also have to make decisions on clones and rootstocks.
Yeah.
How do you make those decisions? And because we really have a diverse range of clones now.
We do. We do. And I mean, I think in a lot of ways, those decisions are made in conjunction with the winemaking that's envisioned as well. And that's critical. The viticulturist isn't just going to show up and say, hey, I think these varieties will grow well here. You want to pair it with, ultimately what we're doing is we're growing wine here. We're not just growing grapes. And so, that was very collaborative with the team winemaking or the Troon winemaking staff, and, still had to be balanced with what was appropriate for different sites and et cetera. You bring up different clones. I think in our case, we really had an intention to try to use clones to bring as much biodiversity, if you want to call it that, to the property, partly because we didn't know what was going to work the best from a clonal point of view. And so trying to, give ourselves more options when it came to what shows up in the winery and what they have to work with seemed like a positive, including taking a given clone and planting it in multiple places on the property and essentially different terroirs. We have really a lot of diversity on this property, so that seemed like a positive too. So we really were thinking about diversity when we decided varieties, when we decided clones. Rootstocks is a little less diverse because we had ideas about what we were trying to accomplish there. But even then, deciding on the right rootstock for the right spot is important. And I think towards the end of this development project, we've started to even fan out a little bit there with rootstock and being a little more experimental, thinking about drought in the future or other things like that. So yeah, just so many things to think about when you replant a property, especially when you're replanting it for a wine program like this that has a cohesive vision that actually is a lot more fun for me than just planting or replanting a property that's just thinking about the economics of farming it, and in the end, the result is, the count of varieties that we have on the property. It's a lot, but I haven't counted
20.
them. 20. Okay, that's a nice round number we ended up with. But I don't count us out that we might not still add a few in the years coming. That's definitely been the MO of this project. Is while there's been some varieties that we knew were going to be cores to the program, really trying to diversify has been a key to almost every aspect of Troon's redevelopment, I would say.
So it's not just vines that are in the vineyard. We have a very, I'd call it complex cover crop
Yes.
plan. What are the strategies for putting in a cover crop, and what are some of the mistakes that we made?
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends, right? And I think what the goal is the really important thing to understand before you decide how to cover crop. But, one of our firm goals from the beginning and still remains today is to try to reduce tillage. And, that doesn't mean having zero tillage, but reducing tillage essentially to allow, soil microbes and just the biology of the soil to function better, because ultimately tillage is going to be disruptive to that. That said, we are still prioritizing the vines, and that is something that is easy to lose sight of sometimes when you're only focusing on cover crop. For example, when we're planting new vineyards, we are pretty religiously doing both annual cover cropping and quite a bit of tillage to try to really give those first few years of a vine's life, the best possible when it comes to access to nutrients, access to water, etc. Those first few years of a vine's life really determine its future in the way that it navigates the rest of its life. And so, we are not going straight to no-till by any means, but we definitely have always had a plan to move in that direction. And I think, in our early days, our aspirations for that were probably a little further out than what was practical. And, we pushed some boundaries knowingly. We knowingly pushed a lot of boundaries in terms of how quickly we could move from a tilled cover cropping system to a no-till cover cropping system, meaning, perennials versus annuals, essentially. And, I think we found where the line was, and in a few cases probably went past it by giving young vines too much competition, essentially. And that has been rectified. And I think that was really something that I don't think the viticulture community really understood, because there hasn't been that much true no-till farming done in viticulture. Classically, viticulture is a very tillage-heavy crop. That's been the standard, partly because grapevines are usually grown in very poor soils, and so we don't have a lot of room to allow a lot of competition. But I think we've sort of been able to dial in how soon you can introduce different forms of no-till in different parts of the vineyard, whether it be the alleyway or directly under the vine. It's taken a number of mistakes, though, to learn what that really looks like. But my hope is that some of that knowledge also can be passed on to other growers, because I think there will continue to be an interest in reducing tillage. And until somebody tries it and pushes those boundaries, we won't know where the boundaries are.
It's kind of interesting because our chef yesterday, he prepared a cover crop salad, and he ran out in the middle of service to pick daikon out of the vineyard.
That's so great. Yeah, our biodiversity, like I said, has been an important part of our cover cropping program, just like all the rest of our strategies. And in the end, daikon has been one of our really prime cover crop species. It's really great for building biomass and being an annual in our annual mix that ends up getting plowed down. But it also has turned out to be a really important insectary plant for us, and we've put it in lots of places that we try to let it flower because it's very early. And then it's also ended up being a crop. We've actually planted a number of plants that could be food crops in the cover crop. The burnet is also a salad, that is used all over the world. And so I think even though that wasn't our priority, in the end, it's been pretty satisfying to see, utilizing the cover crop in multiple ways. And I think, generally it's fair to say the best agricultural decisions have more than one benefit. You do something maybe for a primary reason, but hopefully you have 2 or 3 other reasons that are bringing you some benefit or services, and that's one of them. I think the cover crop has huge amounts of benefit, and it is often in very different angles, whether it be soil health or insectary. So that means, controlling our insect pests, actually, to finding another crop for you guys to sell.
So in addition to the complexity of doing a replant, we also right away brought in biodynamics as our model here for agriculture. I believe that was your first?
Yeah, I've been around biodynamics and worked in different places that use those practices, but definitely Troon has been my education in biodynamics, where I've really learned the intricacies of it.
So what has that experience been like you? Is it, we all kind of had a image of what biodynamics was.
Yeah.
And I know mine changed once I got into it. How has your experience changed?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think I had a similar experience to you. And essentially, I guess I could sum it up in saying that, biodynamics always felt a little bit more like magical thinking than the very hard science background that I come from. But being part of this project really opened my eyes to the fact that there are all kinds of practical elements to biodynamics, and that in fact it's not nearly as dogmatic a philosophy as maybe I had in my mind. I think there are elements that you could prescribe to that, saying, you do this at this time, etc. But, and I guess, just to take a step back, I give a lot of credit to Andrew Beatty and Garrett and, the individuals involved in this project, because I have worked with biodynamic consultants that are far less practical and far less science-based in the way that they approach things. But this team really brings a strong sort of practical science-oriented perspective to biodynamics. And I think maybe my experience here is a little unique, but I would say the biggest adjustment that I've had is to realizing that, one, there are scientific kind of, I don't know if I want to say justifications, but scientific background as to why some of these practices are a good thing to do. It's not, we're not just taking on faith. And that there are lots of practicalities to it that can be evolved. So it is not nearly as prescriptive as I thought. Like I said, I think, there's actually a lot of room for experimentation and for figuring out what practices work for a given site as opposed to just some kind of blanket application. And a lot of that, I think, for me, has been in the learning of producing the preps, because a lot of people don't produce their own preps. A lot of people purchase them, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in my mind, the philosophy really has to do with trying to harness the microbial communities that are on your property. And so it makes sense to try to, produce those preps on the property, which, again, looking from a scientific point of view, I would imagine them, I do imagine them largely as microbial inoculants in a lot of different ways. And so, learning how to make those preps and the different ways you could make them, etc., really illuminated to me that there's a lot of room for, again, experimentation, but also different ways to do things that work for different places, different sites.
Yeah, to me, biodynamics, I always call it as probiotic farming.
Yeah,
we're making these inoculants and then feeding the soil to try to build a natural system.
Yep, I think that's right.
So what are the biggest challenges for viticulturists as working within the biodynamic framework as compared to a conventional?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's important to remember that the foundation of biodynamics is organic, and so a lot of the challenges are just the same as any organic approach would be, which is not insignificant. So, lack of herbicides, all these different things that we have challenges as just any type of organic production for rye grapes. But, I think, I guess integrating biodynamics has been less challenging than I had initially thought. I actually think that, most of the challenge is just time and having enough sort of resources and bandwidth to incorporate everything. But that in and of itself has benefits. It's sort of, even though I believe that all of our biodynamic practices do have benefit, I could probably say that just the fact that it forces us farmers and winemaking staff and everybody to be out in the vineyard more often is in and of itself a benefit. And so I think, it's a positive that it forces us to be out doing more applications or trying to, find time to build the preps at the right time of year, et cetera. I actually don't think that there's a ton of extra challenges that biodynamics presents. I guess the one area I would put out there is just in the products we're allowed to use, because Demeter does have another layer of stringency in terms of what products we're allowed to import onto the farm beyond standard organic, what's allowed in organics. And that can provide some challenges only in that we're restricted on what we're allowed to bring onto the farm. But I can't think of an example in which we weren't able to do what we needed to do. It just might have meant a little bit more navigating through finding the right product to do it.
So we aren't only using biodynamic preparations in our vineyard work. And like every vineyard, our biggest challenge is powdery mildew. You've introduced a whole range of biologicals which have really reduced our sulfur use over the years.
Yeah.
What is this new category of biologicals, and how does that help your toolbox in the vineyard?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think it's applied here, and it really is sort of been a bit of a revolution for all organic grape farming. Traditionally in biodynamics or just organic, grape farming, sulfur has been the primary tool to battle, which is the fungus that's pretty much our main challenge in viticulture across the board, which is powdery mildew, oidium as they call it. And if we are not preemptive at controlling that particular pest, it will become a significant economic problem. So that's why we really focus on that. And again, sulfur has been the go-to for so many decades. It's really only in the last, I would say, about 10 years that we've started to have access to these new products that are mostly plant extracts of some kind or another. A few exceptions to that, but Problad Verde, which is a lupin extract. We have cinnamon oil, incinerate. We have a lot of these natural products that really have just been developed recently, and they work very well. And sometimes they work better than sulfur because they have more broad spectrum impacts. For example, some of them work on botrytis, which is another fungus that we do have issues with. It's just given us more tools in our toolbox. And although I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with sulfur, it is a fairly disruptive product for some insect communities. And just generally, it's probably one of the more caustic products that we use in organic viticulture. So reducing that has felt like a positive in all kinds of ways. I think in the long run, we will see where sulfur fits in, but I think there's been at least 1 year where we've used almost no sulfur and been able to control powdery mildew without a problem. So sort of a test case to prove that point. And I think now we've gone back to using some amount of sulfur because it does have some unique benefits. But big picture, we've really been able to diversify the applications that we do amongst these different products, because traditionally in organic or biodynamic viticulture, you might spray only sulfur like 10 times in the year, and that's the whole program. And I really prefer having these alternatives. The other element to that is that we like to use a lot of, we've been calling these products biologicals, but not to make a distinction here, we also like adding biology to a lot of our foliar sprays. And at least in our instinct, sulfur and biology in the same tank don't necessarily mix. And so it has also allowed us to do a lot more tank mixing with some of our biology and include, a fungicide that we don't believe is going to impact that biology too negatively, and do those all at once.
There's even products for insect control now, like a clay product and
yep, that's
things
true.
Like that. It's pretty fascinating.
It is, yeah. There's another product that we've only used once, we haven't really needed to, but it's actually a fungus that attacks leafhoppers, right? And so we're getting more and more of these alternative products on the market, every year, really. And, we're just talking about viticulture, but really all of agriculture is starting to have a lot more access to soft, natural, pesticides, whether it be fungus or insects. And I think that's a really positive thing, because a lot of these products are a lot safer than what the alternatives are.
So, Troon is only one of your clients. You have your own company. Could you tell us a bit about your company and then also about your own vineyard?
Yeah, sure. I am the owner-operator of Pacific Crest Vineyard Services. I believe it's the oldest vineyard management company in Southern Oregon. The start of Pacific Crest Vineyard Services did not include me. In fact, the previous owner, Randy Gold, started in 2016. 2006. And so years before I even arrived in Southern Oregon. And it was an element of what kept me here as well, because when I did decide, okay, I'm gonna stick it out in Southern Oregon and not take off for one of these more known regions, I was sort of casting about to figure out what I was going to do. And one of the things that I did was just visit people, and I visited Troon. I visited a lot of different people just to get a feel for the place. And one of those people was Randy Gold at his vineyard. It's about a 20-acre vineyard in Talent that's been for years known as one of the better ones in the valley for wine quality. And he really saw an opportunity more than I did to try to, keep his company alive into his retirement, because he didn't have a lot of other options. And so we started a long-term transition agreement that eventually allowed him to retire and me to take over the company. That was around 2015. And so since his full retirement, I've been running the company. We farm about 150 to 175 acres. I think we've gone up to 200 acres a few years ago, scattered throughout the valley. But, that is broken up between 40 acre, 50 acre vineyards down to 2-3 acre vineyards that are in many different places. We've been very blessed to work with a lot of great people. And I think in the end, working with the right people has always been one of the core philosophies of Pacific Crest, working with people that have a passion for wine, really believe in the best farming practices for their property, etc. And, I'm happy to count Troon as a client, but there's a lot of other clients that we work with around the valley that I'm very proud of, including my own vineyard, which is also in Applegate. It's funny. It's in a very different climatically than Troon is, but we can almost see each other across the valley. It's actually not that far as the crow flies. But my property is in the Williams Valley. It's not sort of really the Williams pocket of the Applegate Valley, because it's all part of Applegate Valley, but it's the tributary of Williams Creek, which sort of opens up a little bit to the south and is significantly cooler than the rest of Applegate. So Troon is in one of the warmer sites in Applegate. I'm probably in one of the coldest sites for growing grapes in the Applegate. And that's provided some of its own challenges. But my property is not only a wine producing vineyard, but it is also a nursery propagation block. At least part of it is certified with the ODA as a certified mother block. So we are taking cuttings from my vines and making new grapevines out of them. And that's been a whole nother element of that project. And a big part of the reason why I chose the site, because it's so isolated from other vineyards. And so therefore has much less chance of new pests or viruses or other things infiltrating that site. And so, all of that has been an interesting challenge. We're only talking about 4.5 acres of vineyard, so it's not big. I have more room to plant if I want to, but between the almost 200 acres of other people's vineyards, I've decided not to get too carried away out there, because it's sort of a side project, but it is definitely one that keeps me engaged on the ground. And it's nice to have my own property where I can experiment and do my own things and not feel like I'm diverting too much from what my client wants to do, because whenever I'm doing a project for somebody else, it's a collaborative effort. It's a collaborative effort with those people who are trying to do it. And that's, the one place that I'm able to kind of do it however I want. And I've made lots of mistakes there too, but that's how you learn.
So one of the few wines we make at Troon that isn't from our estate grapes is your Fiano.
Yeah, that's true. That was a really interesting grape that you suggested planting. And I've since, learned that grape as really an interesting one. It is very, very small berried, probably the smallest berries I've ever grown. It's interesting. And, high acid, but very aromatic. It definitely has fit well in where you guys have placed it in that sparkling program. I feel like every year we've gotten a slightly better product out of it as the winemakers have figured this out. But Nate really had an intuition on that one, that was the right home for it. And initially I didn't like that idea, because I really wanted to see what it could do as a white wine. But the more I taste that sparkling wine, the more I love it. And so I'm really pleased with that direction. And on that property we have some more unusual varieties like that. We have Mencia. What else on the more? I'm going to start growing more and more Friulano, but then also Sauvignon Blanc, also Grenache, also Syrah. And so it's been interesting, sort of splitting the difference between some more known quantities and some more unusual things like Fiano that I had never grown before. So it was a real roll of the dice. Glad it worked out.
So now that you've worked biodynamically here at Troon for quite a few years, has that had any impact on your overall philosophy of viticulture?
Well, it has definitely influenced me to start implementing some biodynamic practices at my own property and work with some of my other clients on integrating some of those ideas. Ultimately, what I think Troon has really taught me is that it has taught me the many different ways that you can harness that biology, whether it be biodynamic preps. We make a lot of compost tea that is not necessarily specifically outlined by Steiner and biodynamics, but is, I think, a very positive for soil health, etc. Too many to name. I think I've gained a lot of tools on how to harness that biology, and then trying to apply that to the appropriate situation in different projects has definitely come up. Ultimately, as much as I appreciate a lot of these products, whether they be biodynamics or other sort of biological products, I use quite a bit of them. But the other element that I think I've learned from Troon is really trusting in building the right environment for that biology, if that makes sense. So, it's a little bit of a if you build it, they will come kind of mentality, right? If you create the right environment that is friendly to those microbes that you want to grow, that is just as important, if not more important, than the inoculum that you're putting out there. And so I think that's another element that's adjusted some of my practices, and including in conventional situations, to try to make sure that we're cultivating an environment that's healthy for those microbes, even if we're not adding them as prolifically as we are in Troon. That still is the core of having good microbiology in your system. And I think, we've done a lot at Troon to kind of figure out what the best practices are to do that.
Well, thank you for your time today, Jason. It's always interesting to sit down and talk viticulture with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime.
Is there a place where people can contact you or a website that you can refer them to?
Sure. You can look us up. Look up our website at Pacific Crest. I also have a website for Cole Family Vineyards if you're interested in finding out more about that. And yeah, if you're interested in, our services or just interested in, having a conversation about viticulture, please do look me up.
PacificCrest.com?
It's actually PackCrestVine.com.
PackCrestVine.com.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Troon Talk. For more information, please visit us at troonvineyard.com.